Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It's Sunday, June 14th, 2026, and it's been a while since I posted something on my professional specialty, human behavior and justifications. So I thought I'd do that today in the first of a two-part series. So I want to talk today about why a significant minority of a community or a population might believe something or believe in someone who's objectively harmful to society or even to the supporters themselves. So I want to consider the sociocultural and psychological mechanisms that are involved. So in today's vlog, I'm going to lay out the basic problem that I'm addressing, and I'd like to talk specifically about social status. And then in the companion vlog, I'll lay out the key reasons, or a kind of top 10 list, as to what drives people to continue to believe in people or things that are, as mentioned, objectively harmful by almost any standard. So let's start with the issue then of social status. My late PhD professor, Murray Milner Jr., spent a great deal of his time examining the issue of social status and how it's such a powerful driver of human behavior. That's not to say that there aren't other factors that are incredibly important too, such as economic security, personal safety and survival, health issues, etc. But your sense of status almost always factors in at some level too. So status here refers to the accumulated array of approvals and disapprovals that people express towards an act or even an object. Now here I'm interested specifically in status as a relatively positive or negative social evaluation of people, roughly akin to what we might consider a kind of social ranking in their reputation. Status is always relative. So I teach at a university. If I'm considered popular or if I have a good reputation as a professor, then that's always in comparison, broadly speaking, with the pool of all university professors, or at least those at my university. It's sort of how I might be ranked in the pecking order of professors. That's my relative status. If I win teaching awards or receive 5-star reviews on ratemyprofessor.com or whatever they do in that ratemyprofessor.com thing, then I have a relatively high status. If my ratings are low, if the students give me terrible teaching evaluations or they stay away from my classes in droves, then I have an obviously much lower status as a professor. And like money, I think all else equal, most of us would prefer to have more status rather than less status. Most would rather have, for example, a stellar reputation amongst our peers or in our field or within our communities, rather than a stained or a terrible reputation. But there's an obvious subjectivity involved here too. In rendering our judgments or evaluations, we often are motivated then by a variety of different factors, even things like whether people consider us to be better looking than others. That can influence their beliefs about us as people, about the quality of our ideas, our trustworthiness, and so on. Some people would seem on the surface to be objectively bad or undesirable people based on some very basic metrics. So if I've been adjudicated as a rapist or a killer or a sexual predator or a pedophile in a court of law, then very few people are going to rally to my defense, or they're going to want me in their club. But a few would actually. And if I've been convicted of a string of felonies or for defrauding people, not many people, again, would be inclined to hire me. But some might. And if my Twitter feed, or I guess X feed these days, or Instagram post were filled with hateful or racist or misogynistic rants that targets the various groups en masse, you'd think that that would make me a pariah, or people would turn on me. But not everyone. And if I were a malignant narcissist who only thought of myself above all others, with an overinflated sense of ego, and someone even more who displayed a sense of cruelty towards others, vengefulness and paranoia, I'd probably not have too many friends, but perhaps a few. But remarkably then, some people do manage to acquire status and even rise to the top with one or more of the aforementioned traits, dispositions, and legal judgments against them. So under what conditions then would at least some people judge certain others more favorably and confer status upon them, even if the evidence points to things like malignant narcissism, pathological lying, persistent cruelty, predatory practices, sexual offenses, and self-aggrandizement at the expense of huge swaths of society? Well, on the face of it, or at least on the simplest way to look at that, if I've invested my entire sense of self and identity in a certain set of beliefs about the world or a certain leader who claims to be our savior, well, it'd be very difficult to believe anything to the contrary or to admit that I were wrong somehow in the first place. I had a friend who had devoted a significant portion of their career supporting the work and the philosophy of the Catholic theologian Jean Vanier, the founder of L'Arche, which involved the creation of this network of nonprofits devoted to building a community where those with intellectual disabilities could be treated with respect, could work and thrive, and again, considered to be valuable members of society and treated with dignity. And Vanier received countless awards in his lifetime, including the Order of Canada. And even amongst the public, a 2004 CBC poll ranked Vanier as number 12 on the all-time list of greatest Canadians. Now, he died in 2019, and the following year, evidence came to light of Vanier as having committed sexual abuse against several women between 1970 and 2005. So the basic script involved Vanier initiating sexual relations with certain women under the guise of spiritual guidance. And so much of the good work that Vanier has been credited with doing, and his reputation in general, ended up being tarnished irrevocably. But again, the story of Vanier highlights, I think, the complicated nature of human beings when it comes to their judgments of others and their willingness to confer status upon them. That same fate, of course, has befallen a great many world leaders, especially in the spiritual realms or the world of altruism. Think of the controversies, the mixed receptions these days that when it comes to historical figures like Mother Teresa or Gandhi or MLK Jr., or even the PTL founder Jim Baker and so many others. And yet some people, despite what would seem to be obvious flaws, have managed to rise to the top anyway. And they've become leaders of religious or nationalistic cults with huge followings. So how's that possible? Especially when it comes to cases like a Bill Cosby, who has fallen from grace, of course. Why? Well, I grew up as a huge fan of Cosby and followed his early work as Fat Albert and the Gang, his comedy albums, even The Cosby Show in the 1980s. But then, of course, I learned much later about what he'd done in terms of drugging and then sexually assaulting women, and I lost all respect for him. So I'm not saying he hadn't done some great comedy earlier in his career, but I've not gone back to that work, and I've never considered trying to support Cosby or revive his career in the aftermath of his release from prison. It's a lot like with OJ, right? Whereas I used to watch him on the TV as a football player and even admire to a certain degree his acting chops in the Naked Gun series. When I think of, that's not what I think of when I think about OJ these days. So my point in general then is who would continue to follow or support certain individuals, or especially the cult leaders, if you will, even in the face of sometimes horrifying evidence of their moral failings? Or perhaps more accurately, what factors then would continue to drive at least some people to support those whose words and behaviors often highlight the worst traits and genuinely harmful actions towards real individuals and groups. Well, a certain segment, obviously, of society has been damaged themselves and operates with a truly distorted lens in terms of their worldviews. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting there's one right worldview or that I have the right worldview. We all have biases and distortions of reality, myself included, to varying degrees. But rather, I want to suggest that most of us operate within a broad normal range, if you will. That is, plus or minus even 2 standard deviations from the average, or around 95% of the population as a whole. So, for example, whatever the absolute truth about the first series of moon landings or beliefs about whether or not the Earth is flat, only about 5% of the population completely denies the moon landings, and an even smaller percentage declares unequivocally that the Earth is flat. So in other words, at least 95% of people can agree on certain basic facts, and certainly even things that are rather controversial, at least amongst a small segment of society. The things that where conspiracy theorists often cast their shade. But of course, there are many other things that are less definitive, less obvious, less certainly true, and we see lower levels of agreement. So, for example, there are some things that only about 2/3 of the population believes, or about plus or minus 1 standard deviation. Now, technically about 68.26 or 27%. But if you're the Pope, or you're the Prime Minister, or you're the President, and only 1 in 3 people say approves of what you're doing, then you're barely treading water to stay afloat. So look what happened recently to Viktor Orban in Hungary just a couple of months ago, where he, or his party actually, received less than 38% of the national vote, and they lost power accordingly. But of course, that means that there's still more than 1/3 who believed in Orban, or at least in his Fidesz party, rightly or wrongly. But it's more than just politics involved. So in the next vlog, what I'd like to do then is identify what I believe to be the top 10 reasons why there's a significant minority, or perhaps even as much as 1/3 of people, who will tend to fall in line with or support or confer status on certain rather disturbing individuals or harmful cult leaders or personalities, despite, and sometimes perhaps even because, of their cruelty or their willingness to hurt others. So how can that be? Well, that's what we'll look at in the companion to this particular vlog. So in the meantime, as ever, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and dole out hugs in abundance. Peace.